Hello and welcome. I'm Liz Booker, literary Aviatrix, and I'm excited to talk with the author of the Aviatrix Book Club discussion book for May 2024 about her historical fiction novel, Great Circle. Fewer than 10% of pilots and aircraft mechanics are women. These are their stories of tenacity, adventure, and courage. Stories with the power to inspire, heal, and connect. Welcome to the literary Aviatrix community, where we leverage the power of story to build and celebrate our community and inspire the next generation of aviation. Maggie Shipstead, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I am so excited to talk to you about this gorgeous, sweeping novel. For anyone who hasn't had a chance to read the book yet, could you give us a synopsis of Great Circle?
Absolutely. Great Circle is about a fictional female pilot named Marion Graves who disappears in 1950 while trying to fly around the world north-south, so over the poles. And that's intercut with a story of a modern-day movie star named Hadley Baxter, who's playing Marion in sort of a biopic about her life.
It's amazing. That's such a simple synopsis of a really huge saga from my perspective. And I'll just gush about...
if I go any deeper than that, it's like a 5-minute thing. It's like the 2-sentence thing and 5-minute thing.
Well, we'll round it out in the conversation here.
Sure.
And I just want to gush about some things about it first. First of all, these characters are so deeply and richly well drawn. This is the kind of story that I fell in love with as a teenager. You know, a saga, an East of Eden, or a Michener book where we get to follow characters for decades and see how, they navigate through their respective times. And, I'm thrilled that you decided to include, a pilot character in this and to follow not only her journey, but in places in this book where you place her in the context, just some of the choices that you made about her own path and the context that you give us in these very condensed, beautifully written summaries of where she is in the history of aviation and what's going on in the aviation world. I absolutely loved those passages. And I think they're very instructive too, for people who maybe don't know the history of aviation. So that was so well done. I have so many questions about the inception of this idea and, how you wrote it. But first, just give us kind of like an overview of your writing life. I want to talk more about that in the writing portion and get deeper into it, but just how did you become a writer?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, again, this is a story that can be real short or really long, but I wasn't one of those children who always wanted to write or, wrote short stories, but I was always a reader. And so I went to college, not really planning even to study English, but that's what I fell into. And then I went to grad school for creative writing at the University of Iowa Writers Workshop. And the year after that, when I was 25, I wrote my first novel, Seating Arrangements. And then I was at Stanford for 2 years on a writing fellowship. Seating Arrangements came out. My second novel came out pretty rapidly after that, within 2 years. And then it was a nice long 7 years until Great Circle came out. So yeah, I consider myself primarily a novelist. I also write short stories and I write for travel magazines pretty regularly. I was doing more before COVID, but I write for like Condé Nast Traveler and Outside and the New York Times, things like that.
Well, where can we find all of that kind of work?
Yeah, if you go to www.maggieshipstead.com, there are different tabs. So the one that says articles has a lot of my shorter writing, travel writing and essays. And then there's a link to books. There's some videos. You can also find me on Instagram. That's pretty much the only social media I use. But
excellent. Yeah. Okay, let's get into this book. I have to hear everything. How on earth did you come up? What's the inception? What inspired you? Why a pilot? Tell me all of it.
Yeah, so it was kind of an accident. I had sort of started writing what I thought would be my second book when I was at Stanford. So this was in my sort of mid-20s. and it just sort of wasn't going anywhere. And so I got sidetracked revising a short story that became my actual second book, Astonish Me, which is about ballet. And then after Astonish Me was done, was in edits, I said, okay, I'm going to go back to that original book idea that I thought was going to be my second book. And at the time I was traveling, I was in Australia and New Zealand for a month or 6 weeks, something like that. And this would be in 2013. So my first book was out. My second book was on its way out. I'm in New Zealand trying to work on this manuscript. It's not happening. So I kind of realized this is dead. I have to give up on it. And I was getting ready to leave New Zealand. I was sitting at the international terminal, and there's a statue of the pilot Jean Batten there, like a bronze statue. And it's a really beautiful image of her. She's wearing this sort of overcoat, and she's waving to some imaginary crowd and holding a bouquet of flowers. And I read the plaque, and it said something like, I was born to be a wanderer, or something like that. And that stuck in my head. I thought, oh, I should write a book about a pilot. And for people who aren't familiar with her, she was the first person to fly solo from the UK to New Zealand, which was in 1934, 36. I'm starting to forget all the relevant dates. But anyway, so I was like, okay, perfect. A book about a pilot, no problem. And the inscription on her statue became the first line of Great Circle, which is, oh no, I think hers was "as destined to be a wanderer," and I was born to be a wanderer. But I had no plan for the book. I'm not an outliner. And so all I knew is that she would disappear flying around the world north-south. And I had chosen her route around the world, which sort of, there are kind of two possibilities just because of geography. And I'd chosen her plane, a C-47. And so I sat down and started writing, and found myself writing about the launch of an ocean liner in 1912 or 19 something like that. And so then I started to get an inkling that this book was just going to sprawl and sprawl. And maybe within a month of working, I'd introduced Hadley, the movie star. But it just, it became this really expansive project I wasn't anticipating. And it took over 3 years to write the first draft, which was almost 1,000 pages.
I am so relieved to hear that. And I was going to save this for the writing portion of this. But, I had a couple of questions about just being a writer like you and writing a piece like this. Like, I wanted you to tell me that this was hard, because if you told me that this was easy for you, I would have been like, yeah, it's never going to happen. Never going to happen for me. I'll never be able to write like this. And secondly, or on the other hand, I also wondered if, when somebody tells you that your characters are so richly drawn and your descriptions are so lovely, are you like, well, duh, I'm a writer. That's my job. If somebody told me I did such a great job flying straight and level, I'd be like, well, I'm kind of a pilot. That's what I do. But thanks. Yeah,
I mean, a little bit. I think the compliment about the characters, which thank you, by the way, is specific. I think one thing when people be like, well, this is beautifully written. And I'm like, yeah, it's my third novel. That's a funny one, I guess. And I see that a lot. I don't read like my Amazon reviews or Goodreads or anything like that. But to a degree, it is my job. And this certainly was difficult. Like, what I'm finding is that it kind of never gets easier. Like, I guess my second book was borderline easy. I wrote it in 5 months from start to selling it to my publisher. And so that sort of set me up to be like, this is what I do. I just toss these off, and I started this book sort of with the expectation I'd write it within a year. And that was, I just hadn't grasped the scope and the research, and something so research heavy, is like climbing a sand dune. It's like, it's just pushing you backwards the whole time.
That is a great metaphor. Another author that we talk about a lot because she has written prolifically in historical fiction that features women in aviation is Elizabeth Wein, who her book Codename Verity was, she claims, like the easiest thing she ever wrote. But she's like, and of course is a bestseller, but she's still a working writer. And I wrote to her a couple months ago and I was like, I'm struggling. And she said, you know what? It took me 11 rewrites to finish the novel that I just published. So it doesn't ever get easier. Yeah,
you do. And it's a question of keeping momentum alive. Like, I think, what was helpful for me with this book was that I was passionate about some of the underlying questions, and I really put most of the things I was interested in into this book. Just it all went in, and so that was really sustaining. Even though there were some particularly difficult times, and even some of the technical choices I struggled with, like past tense or present tense, first person, third person. Although Marion's part of the book, the pilot's part of the book, sort of from the first draft on was pretty much the same chronology, and it didn't change all that much. And the harder part was sort of bringing the two components of the book together.
Yeah, that dual perspective thing is one of my favorites, and you did that so well in this book also. I love, and I love that they're in separate times, separate historical periods, and just the look back. So, talking about Marion, you made a lot of really interesting choices, interesting to me, thinking about what your options were. I don't want to spoil, certainly not the ending, so we won't do that, but assume that most people, if you got this far, hopefully you've read the book. In particular, I am curious about the choice of when you send her into World War II, deciding to make her an air transport auxiliary pilot. Tell me about that choice.
Yeah, so that was actually one of the few things I knew from the beginning. I knew she would disappear, and I knew she'd fly during the war, but I hadn't decided between the US or the UK, both of which were historically possible. And I kind of did the research for both, even when I was really far away from it, in the chronology of writing the book. I don't think I got to that part of the book until I'd been drafting for at least a year and a half. I can't, it's hard to reconstruct these decisions. I think I was just interested in sending her to a different environment. I read Diana Barnado Walker's memoir, Spreading My Wings, about flying in the ATA, and there were just some really exciting elements of that I borrowed actually for the book, like how she was sort of toward the end of the war flying to continental Europe, and she had this sort of racket going where she would bring back chocolate, and like she didn't bring a parachute, and she just used that space for bringing back things that you couldn't get in the UK at the time. So I was just intrigued by the setting, and it seemed interesting and manageable. And so one of my research trips, I went up to Stanford to the Hoover Institution, where they had the personal papers of a few of the pilots, and tiny print and onion skin letters home, that sort of thing. And it had their ferry pilot notes and all these sort of personal photos. And those women were just so cool. So that was a really fun actual part of the research.
I bet.
Yeah, I went to the museum at the ATA Museum at Maidenhead in England. And it was pretty funny because, the museum's not just about the female pilots, it's about all the pilots. And volunteer took me, there's sort of this slightly stuffy guy who was in charge of the whole thing. And he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I'm writing a book about a pilot." He said, kind of went, "Ugh." And I was like, "Don't over romanticize it and don't over dramatize it." And I was like, "Okay, I'll try my best." And then a volunteer took me upstairs to fly like a Spitfire simulator, and so I flew it, and I'm not a pilot, but it was fun. And we went back downstairs, and this sort of stuffy guy was like, "Oh, how'd it go?" And the volunteer said, "Oh, great pilot." And he goes, "Oh, is he still up there?" Like it couldn't possibly have been me.
Welcome to our world.
Oh, exactly. I know. I was like, even in this museum that has this big display about these pilots, and it was like, where's the man you're talking about?
Happens every day. Happens every day. Wow, so great. I love that you just sniffed out that trail. What I thought it did for you, as well as, a writer, was it brought her closer to the war, so that the people who she knew who were over there, she could meet up with sort of in theater, instead of
absolutely
being sort of, I think the ATA was so much closer to the action in the war, whereas our women, were stuck here in the continental US for the most part, except for those who went over and did the ATA first. So that was really great. Yeah, that was really great. And of course, you incorporate all of the history around that, including Jackie Cochran and all of the great, very rich history around that whole part aviation. There's another choice that you made that I find really interesting because it also happens in Kate Quinn's book when she writes about the Night Witches, that you both chose to put your characters in a situation where they were having same-sex relations with the other women. And I'm just curious about that choice. Is that based on like research that you guys did and that's what you found out happened, or tell me about that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely found traces of it in my ATA research, like in this sort of reunion notes from the American pilots. It would be like, I can't remember any specific names, but it'd be like, Claire has lived on a ranch with her friend Frida for the past 20 years. And it was sort of this, coded code for these relationships. And I also, from the beginning, I thought Marion had sort of a slippery relationship to gender and sexuality. And part of it was just that I, started with this idea of this woman vanishing, and I almost had to reverse engineer how would she get to be that pilot in 1950? Like, how do you have the means to attempt this flight? How do you learn to fly as a girl in the 20s and 30s? And sort of what I came up with her childhood in Montana, pretty feral childhood with a benignly neglectful uncle, was just that she, wasn't really aware of the limitations that were socially imposed on women starting from the beginning, and kind of had the opportunity to think of herself as almost genderless as a child. And then she starts hitting these roadblocks as a woman. And I think she just as a person is kind of, open in a way. And so when she meets a woman she's connects with, she's willing to try it out. And it was just, it aligned with the historical record, and I think also with the character.
That's so interesting. And a lot of what you said is very reflective, I think, of a lot of us. Like, we talk a lot in our circles about being surprised when we finally got to aviation, and, professionally, we were surprised that we weren't welcome because we had no idea, because whatever context that we were living in as a child that allowed us to imagine ourselves wanting to do this thing did not put gender limits on us. And so It was just a huge shock to enter the environment and discover that we weren't wanted. So I thought I think that's very accurate. And well done developing.
And a real
character.
Encounter with injustice where you're like, wait, what do you mean?
Yeah.
And I also noticed, like, as I said, I'm not a pilot, and part of the reason is just that my brother was in the Air Force for 20 years and was a C-130 pilot for sort of the first half of that. And so he was always obsessed with airplanes. I never had any interest in flying. I was behind the controls of a glider for like 5 minutes once, and I did not like it. And I've noticed that people who fly like have this deep instinct. They're like, I need to fly. This is something I need to do. I'm going to find a way to do it. And so part of the reason I didn't really pursue taking lessons even when I was writing this book was I was like, there's just something in me that says this is not for you. And I don't have great spatial relations, that sort of thing. But it does seem to be a real common thread. People will move mountains to fly.
They will. And, you're forgiven for not wanting to fly because you brought your beautiful writing talent to us. So we appreciate that. You talked a few minutes ago, you mentioned that you were in the writing trying to address some underlying questions. Talk about some of those.
Yeah, I think fairly early in the writing process, a friend of mine said, if you had to say in one word what this book is about, what would it be? And I said, scale. And she was like, that's not super sexy, but okay. But that really was what I was thinking about. How do you measure one life against the size of the planet? How do you measure the planet against the universe, the life against time, all these sort of impossible to reconcile dimensions. And what Marion's doing in her round the world flight is she's just trying to, see as much as she can. But the thing is, you make that circle and you're back where you started. So what does that mean? So I was interested in that. I was traveling a lot and doing travel writing. I would pitch stories for places I needed to go that connected to the book. So I ended up becoming a little bit of a polar specialist with my travel writing, and was also seeking out, ways to fly, not myself, but experiencing different kinds of aircraft, like landing on ice. I did a story for Outside where I rode in the back of a C-130 from upstate New York to Greenland. And we landed on the ice cap in Greenland on skis, and what I was trying to do is get a sense of the Antarctic interior, because that applies to the end of the story. And so that was one. I was interested in this sort of courage required to be a woman with an unorthodox life. Like Marion, it's not just one decision to be like, I'm gonna lead a different sort of life for women in the 20s and 30s. It's a decision she had to make over and over and over again, just sort of rejecting a more domestic existence. And then I was also interested in this question of disappearance. You say you're writing a book about a female pilot who disappears, and people are like, so about Amelia Earhart? And I'm like, no, it's not about Amelia Earhart. But what interested me maybe most about Amelia Earhart, and obviously she's a fascinating person, wildlife, but I was like, why is it so hard for people to accept that she probably crashed in the ocean and died? Like, the difference between disappearance and death is really hard for people to wrap their heads around. And I think particularly because it was this, vivacious, charismatic, energetic woman, it just became like, no, she has to have had this island castaway existence or something. So I was also interested in exploring that.
Yeah. Wow. Well, you were successful, I think, on all counts. And thank you for sharing all that. And one of the things that I felt when almost in the middle of the book, but definitely towards the end, is that it's not just about this pilot. It's just about the human experience and all those scales that you were just talking about and all those comparisons. And it almost felt like that book had so much truth in it. Like, you captured so much human truth in a story that it almost feels like it's too much human truth for one person to know. Like, for you to, it's almost, even though I intuit all of those human truths as well, it's just having them all encapsulated in a package like this that presents them is both overwhelming, and just feels so insightful. Like, you can see, I mean, I'm assuming that you're not, an accomplished artist. You've already shared that you're not an accomplished pilot. So you have obviously done so much work to come, to make those things feel natural in the narrative. But then also just like all of the spectrum of human experience is so well captured in this book. So I will stop gushing.
Oh, thank you.
That is how I felt. I felt overwhelmed by that, in the way that brought me joy reading those other authors that I talked about when I was young. So I loved that. So what things surprised you in your research that we haven't talked about yet, or what other parts of this story in terms of Marion and the choices you made were really big decisions, and how did you come to those?
Yeah, I mean, so much of the plot of the book actually derives from research, because I'd sort of, started to acquaint myself with the history of aviation, which I honestly knew very little about going into it. I had sort of, the background you pick up just from having a pilot in the family, an older brother who you think is cool as a child. So I was sort of aware of some things about aviation, but I don't know, like learning about the sort of barnstormers, I thought, okay, here's a way Marion could have an early encounter with airplanes in Montana, and also finding really specific aviation history in Montana. Oh, this was another good kind of serendipitous piece of luck. I spent 2 months in Missoula, Montana, in 2014 before I started writing the book. And I'd had the idea for the book, but I thought I was going to set it in Nebraska. And so I wrote a little bit while I was there, but it wasn't until after I left, I thought, oh, Missoula is a pretty good setting. And so I was working, and maybe after another year, I went back to do more specific research. And I went to their little aviation museum, and they have a C-47 there. So I was in the cockpit and kind of wandering around. And these two guys came and pushed open the doors of the little hangar and started pushing out this historic aircraft. And just over their shoulder to the person at the desk, they were like, "Tell that lady if she wants to come, she can come too." And so that was me. I was the lady. And so I went up with them in a 1927 Travel Air.
Cool.
That became the plane I had Marion learn to fly. So it was like I could see it, I could smell it, I could take video, I could see Missoula from that vantage. And that was amazing. And so that, guided what type of plane she learned to fly in. And yeah, there's this sort of native figure that plays a role sitting in the water grizzly was a real person I found in the historic record.
I was hoping that was true. I didn't look it up, but I was hoping that was true. That's cool.
Yeah, it seemed, for people who haven't read it yet, it's this native person who is first encountered by explorers as a woman and marries a member of a trader's sort of retinue, and then vanishes and reappears now living as a man with a wife and sort of giving these prophecies. And I think that was in some ways like quite common amongst the indigenous population. But these explorers, I think indigenous people were so other to them already that they weren't very fazed by it. They were just sort of like, sitting in the water grizzly is a man now. And it would just be sort of recorded in the journals of these different people. And he was a translator too, which I thought was a beautiful detail. So I wrote this sort of there are these little sections in the book, the incomplete histories. And so I wrote one for sitting in the water grizzly really early in the book without knowing how it would tie in later, if it would, but I just had it. I really enjoyed writing those incomplete histories like I did of the history of aviation as I went, although they did, as I said, when I finished my first draft, it was 980 pages. And that's about how long it was when I sold it to my publisher. And my editor was like, "This is too long." And so over the course of several drafts, I cut more than 200 pages, but I did it really just with small pervasive cuts. And so those incomplete histories got really condensed. And there used to be one of Antarctica that got cut, but I was pretty staunch that they needed to stay in, and also that it just needed to be a long book. I think, people are scared of long books sometimes. And so there was talk about cutting all sorts of things, but I thought, for what this book is about, it just needs to be fat. And
we're so grateful. I'm so grateful that, and actually I didn't want it to end. And my husband is listening to it right now, and he has 2 hours left, and he's like, "I don't want it to end." It's like a 25,
that's nice.
It's like a 25-hour audiobook. And so when you get into it, it's like binge watching, your favorite show. You don't want it to end.
Yeah.
And so that's where he is with it right now.
I have to say, by the time I was reading the second round of proofs, I was ready for it to end. I was like, why did I had to read it so many times. I was just like, why did I do this to myself? I can't read this book anymore.
That's awesome. That is so funny. Oh my gosh. Did you ever make it to Antarctica yourself?
Yes, I've been twice. I went in late 2015. Is that right? No, maybe it was early 2016. Yeah. I actually wrote a New York Times Modern Love about this. It was essentially a first date, a 5-week long first date from New Zealand with the expedition leader of this trip. So I got on the ship having met this man before. We knew we wanted to see each other again. And this was kind of the way to do it. And that was amazing. We went through the New Zealand subantarctic down to the Ross Sea region, so to McMurdo Station, and to where she would have, to the Ross Ice Shelf, which is where Marion's sort of second landing place in Antarctica. And then I went again on an assignment for a travel magazine from South America, I think in 2018. But yeah, Antarctica would have been the big hurdle for a flight like hers in that era, because in 1950, there were no permanent bases and no sort of, it's still a real navigational challenge from everything I've heard from pilots down there. But I sort of lined up her flight with a historic expedition to East Antarctica that could conceivably carry fuel. And then if she got really lucky, she could fly across the interior to the Ross Ice Shelf, where there would have been cached fuel as well. And then take off again for New Zealand. So yeah, it was really important for me to see these polar regions. I just felt like I couldn't imagine them without seeing them. And so that was a big part of my pitches for travel magazines.
That's so great. What a great way to do that as an author, to get that research, is to write your way into them. That's awesome. Yeah. And I want to just on a personal note. So Antarctica has been a thing that has plagued me my whole life. I enlisted in the Coast Guard when I was 18, and out of boot camp, of the opportunities for women available, one of them was a polar icebreaker. And I had first choice out of boot camp for the women, but it was going to be in the yards for 6 months, this ship. And so it wouldn't be getting underway. I wouldn't go anywhere. And I had all these plans of getting advancing and going to training schools. So I missed the opportunity then. Then as a pilot, we had this polar operations division that put helicopters, the helicopter that I flew for a living, on the back of those polar breakers and went down there. But I had a small child at home, a baby, and those deployments are 6 months long. And I just couldn't do it to her and to myself. But what happened was my eldest son joined the Coast Guard, and he got to serve on that ship and go to McMurdo. So the Coast Guard ship is the one that goes down and opens that channel that goes to McMurdo. So I get to live vicariously through my son. So anyway, it's really cool.
I hope you get there for yourself too someday. It is spectacular. And I think it is. Yeah. I took my mom with me when I went for the magazine, and it changed her life. I think she became obsessed with penguins. She actually died a year and a half ago. And her one sort of after life wish that she expressed, and only to me it turned out, was that she wanted her ashes scattered in the ocean off of Antarctica, which I have not done yet, but I will. But it really,
that's just an interesting, that's fiction inspiring real life, That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So is there anything else that you would like to talk about Marion in this book before I start asking you to give us a summary of your other work and then what you're working on now?
Not off the top of my head. I feel like it might come back as we talk about writing, but yeah, we kind of covered the big points, I think.
Okay. So you referred to a couple of other books earlier that you've already published. Can you just give us a little synopsis of those so we know, if we want to go read more of your work, what we're getting into?
Sure. Yeah. It's all very different. My first novel, was about a sort of waspy wedding on a fictionalized Nantucket, and the main character is the father of the bride. And that sort of came out of, I grew up in Southern California, and I went to Harvard and had quite a bit of cultural shock getting there. It's just this really different world. And I had a really waspy boyfriend my senior year from Greenwich, and sort of encountered this subculture that I found really interesting. And I wrote a short story in my second year of grad school at Iowa that I couldn't really make work. And my teacher at the time said, well, maybe it's too much for a short story. Maybe it should be a novella. And I was like, the world needs more of this, even though now I know that's just something you say. And so I had a little bit of fellowship money after I graduated, and I went and spent 8 or 9 months on Nantucket in the off season and wrote that book. Cool. And it's has a little bit of a satirical edge to it, I guess. And then my second book, Astonish Me, is a Cold War ballet drama. My mom was a really big ballet fan and had always been. So I'd seen a lot of ballet, also not a dancer. So I think there's a little bit of a subculture theme in my books. I'll sort of go into these worlds. And then Great Circle. And then I also have a collection of short stories called You Have a Friend in 10A, which were written sort of, the earliest one in there I wrote at Iowa. And then over the course of about a decade, and they're all in sort of different places and have different tones. And I think of short stories in some ways as a little bit of a laboratory.
So what are you working on now?
So I've been working on a new novel probably for a year and a half. And I was trying really hard to keep it simple. I was like, I don't want to do research. I don't want to write anything historical. I live in LA. I'm going to write a novel set in LA about a contemporary family. But it turns out it's still really hard. And I think my sort of MO shifted over all the years I spent on Great Circle to be, used to dealing with something that gets bigger and sprawls. And so I really got myself mired. And I've reworked the first 150 pages so many times. And so I'm actually in the middle of taking a pause that may be a fatal pause. I don't know. I'm just going to see if I can think of how to sort of reframe it, or if I need to switch projects. But yeah, it's been.
Is there a topic out there that you haven't hit yet that's like screaming at you? You need to go there someday?
I mean, I think if there were, that's what I would do that now. I'm like in the place where I would pursue a different idea. I have sort of fragments of ideas. But one thing I found with the book I've been struggling with is that I never had kind of the one sentence description of it like I could give with all my other books. And even Great Circle is the only book I wrote that started as a novel. My first two novels were both short stories that got out of control. But at least like I had a sense of the sort of confines of it, and I had the voice. And so I think part of the reason Great Circle got so big was, I say it's like building a house without a blueprint. Just like end up with stairways to nowhere and turrets and things like that. But yeah, this book, I don't know. It also has just been a challenging time in my life. Like my mom died and I got married in the past year and a half.
Congratulations.
And I think sometimes thank you. Sometimes things just sort of all come together and either make your work or break it. And I haven't figured out, if it's broken yet, but it might be. And yeah.
Well, good luck figuring that out or moving on to the next thing if that's what you decide to do. And Maggie, thank you so much. Honestly, thank you so much for bringing your beautiful writing talent, your tenacity to write for 7 years and actually get it published and create this character. When I graduated from my Master of Fine Arts in Writing, I said to all my classmates it was a young adult and children's and young adult program. And I was like, may you all include female pilot characters in your books, no matter how you choose to do it, whatever genre you're writing, please include one of us. And so thank you so much for including us in your work.
Oh, thank you. Well, your seal of approval means a lot, since there's always a little bit of a gamble in writing about things you don't know. Same with my ballet book. After it was out and I heard from dancers, I was like, oh, thank God. It worked. It's okay. Yep. Yeah.
Where can we find you? You gave us your website earlier, but are you on social media anywhere? Tell us where to find you.
Just Instagram. I'm at Shipstead, and that's the only one I kind of actively use. I guess I still have a Twitter handle, but I don't go there very much anymore.
Yeah, me too. I'm in the same boat. Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for listening. I'd like to thank Michael Wilds of Massif and Crew for his help producing this interview and his support of all things literary Aviatrix. Please join us in the book club next month when we'll discuss the book, The Fabulous Flying Mrs. Miller. Blue skies and happy reading.
I'm ready to go again. I'm ready to say